So welcome everyone to the Assessor Recorder's Office Transfer Tax Media Roundtable today. I am Vivian Poe, Communications Director to Assessor Carmen Chu. As you may have heard from Assessor Chu before, as she also served as the co-chair of the Economic Recovery Task Force, how COVID-19, the pandemic, has really impacted our local economy. And today we are turning to a different angle and looking at a very specific data that comes from our office, the transfer tax data. It is a one-time fee that is collected by our office during transaction. So as you can imagine, it provides us as a very unique window in kind of helping us understand the trends of the real estate market of today's. So without further ado, I will invite our presenter of today, Assessor Carmen Chu, to join us.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank you everybody for joining our press roundtable today. I hope everybody had a really great Thanksgiving, and of course that you're staying safe as much as possible during this time. As you know, our office is responsible for a number of real estate items, including the transfer tax collection for San Francisco. And you're also aware that in terms of transfer tax reporting, we typically have done a report to our media partners on a quarterly basis, typically in terms of where our transfer tax revenue is. So today's roundtable really provides an update for you about how things are going in terms of transfer tax collections and the number of transactions that we're seeing in San Francisco so far. So I'm going to just share a few slides with you and then of course open it up for any questions that you might have, but hopefully the slides will answer some questions that you might have about what the state of real estate transactions are in the city and county of San Francisco. So I'm going to share screen. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, I can see it, Carmen.
Great. So let's begin. So this is really a graph that shows you kind of where the numbers have been in terms of the volume of transactions that have happened in the marketplace for multiple years going back. You see that each of the chart or each of the bar graphs here that you see shows a different fiscal year, going all the way back to fiscal year 16-17 in terms of the number of transactions that happened, as well as the total revenue that the city collected in transfer tax. So just sharing with you, last year, fiscal year 2019-20, we had 7,447 transactions that in total generated revenue of $335 million. You can see kind of where we were in past years. We might have had more transactions, but in terms of the number of revenue or the amount of revenue that we collected as a city, it's gone from the high of $411 million to the low of 302 over the last few fiscal years. A lot of that has to do with the number of large value transactions that happen in the city, and we'll get into a little bit more of that detail later on. But as you can see for this current year, this is you see that last bar chart where it shows July through October. It's much lower, but just note that this is representing only 4 months of data so far. And so we still have the rest of the year to capture. So of course, this is not exactly apples to apples comparison just yet, but we wanted to show you where things were as of October of 2020. So so far in the current fiscal year, we've had 2,774 transactions, totaling about $88 million in total transfer tax revenue that's been collected so far. Many people have been asking us about what we're seeing in terms of the marketplace, whether we're seeing a slowdown in transactions or whether it looks something different. Here you can kind of see what it looked like month to month compared to where we were this year and last year. The reason why we show kind of where it is month to month is because we're comparing July to October and July to October of 19 versus 2020, is because sometimes real estate transactions may be cyclical in nature in terms of the type, the number, or the month of the year. And so we just want to make sure that we're trying to capture and trying to drown out as much of the cyclical nature of transactions as much as we can. So you can see here, when we make a comparison between 2019 and 2020, that the number of transactions last year compared to this year is a little bit higher. So about 2,977 last year from July through October versus 2,774 in this current fiscal year. The number that we got in terms of the revenue collected last year compared to this year with almost the same number of transactions. So you'll note 2,900, 2,700 is pretty close. It's about 200 or so transactions of a difference, but the revenue is significantly different. Last year, from July through October, we collected $157 million in transfer tax revenue, but this year so far, we've only collected $88 million for that same time period in this current year. And so again, you might wonder, well, how can it be when you have kind of similar number of transactions that are happening, but you have significantly less in terms of revenue? Well, it's because of the way that our transfer tax structure is. If you are a transaction that is higher valued, you're actually taxed at a higher rate. And typically, much of our revenue has come from large value transactions. So if we don't see very many of those large, expensive properties transitioning, whether it's a downtown office building or a hotel, for example, then you're not going to see as much revenue jump in for the city. So this kind of gives you a comparison to say, roughly, we're somewhat down in terms of the number of transactions, but we're pretty significantly down in terms of the transfer tax revenue for the same period of time compared to last year. In another look, breakdown of where the numbers and revenue have come in so far. So this again is just showing you the 4 months of data so far. So from July through October, you see that we have broken out in this pie chart, essentially all the different tier groups, so the tax tiers and how much of the total revenue it represented. What is really stark is if you take a look and you see that green big section that says 47%, and if you also see that orange section that says 6%, right? These are, if you add those two up, it's well over 50%, right? It is actually 53% of total revenue is essentially coming from transactions that are valued at $10 million or more. And so that's pretty significant, right? So you think about it, most of the transfer tax revenue we've collected so far is coming from very high valued property. And to kind of give you a flavor of how dependent our transfer tax revenue is on large transactions, that 47%, that almost $40+ million in revenue that we've collected, $41 million or so, it's actually coming from 13 transactions. So recall earlier in this previous slide where I shared with you that we had 2,774 transactions so far, totaling $88 million in revenue. Well, 13 of those 2,774 transactions comprised $41 million of transfer tax revenue. So 13 transactions led up to more than almost up half of what we've collected so far in revenue so far. So that's a pretty big piece to kind of understand here is that, again, transfer tax revenue by far is coming in from those high tax tier transactions that occur, but there are not very many of them. The final thing I want to draw your attention to, and we'll continue to share more information with you as we have it in terms of our transfer tax information, is that, as you know, Proposition I passed this past November. What it did was that it raised the tax rates for properties that are $10 million and higher, essentially doubling what the tax rates are in both of those tiers. So if you are a property that is $10 million to $25 million, or if you're $25 million and above, essentially the tax rate that you would be paying on that transfer tax transaction would be double what it was previously. Proposition I is scheduled to go into effect January 1st of this year. So it'll be interesting to see if we're going to see all of a sudden a number of transactions that happen at the end of the year to try to avoid this tax tier or having to dip into this new tax tier. Typically, what we have seen in the past when new propositions have passed that raise tax rates for high value property is that you might see sort of a flurry of activities that happen where large transactions happen right before that new tax rate comes into effect. It's unclear whether that will happen this year because we've also seen, as you've seen with our revenue numbers, that we're seeing fewer high value properties transact. So it's possible that people are simply holding on to properties because at this moment they're not feeling confident that it's a good market to sell or to buy in. So this will be interesting for us to see in the next month where these numbers play out. And so I think that is all we have in terms of the slide presentation for you today. I am happy to take any questions that you might have, but I'm going to take my screen share off.
Thank you, Carmen. This is Vivian again, and I just want to supplement one piece of data. When we were looking at our last year fiscal year data, we also had a chance to look at the average monthly transactions and revenue, comparing before having COVID-19 and after. So, Carmen, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that so that we can see the immediate impact of the pandemic.
Yeah, sure. Before the pandemic, so when we were taking a look at July through March data, for example, we saw that the average monthly transaction count, so the number of transactions that happened in any given month, was roughly on average 682, bringing in revenues of roughly 33 million on a monthly basis, kind of averaged out during that period of time from July through March of 2020. Right during the time we kind of hit kind of the beginning part of the pandemic, when many people were kind of adjusting to working remotely and a number of different challenges that we had, the average monthly transaction dropped pretty significantly. It dropped about 36% from, again, an average of 682 down to an average of 435, with revenues coming in roughly about $12 million. So $33 million on average before the pandemic to $12 million on average during the months of April, May, and June. Since that time, since June, we've actually started to see an uptick again in the number of transactions and revenue coming in. However, the revenue that's coming in isn't as high as it was prior to the pandemic. So right now, if we take a look at kind of what our average monthly transaction numbers are and the revenues that come in, when we take a look at July through October, for example, we see that our monthly transactions is about the same. It's about 694 transactions. However, the revenue is 22 million a month versus 33 million a month. So again, we're kind of seeing that in terms of the number of monthly transaction counts, it's about keeping on pace to where we were last year, roughly before the pandemic. However, the revenue is coming in lower. So what that is suggesting to us is that we're seeing transactions still happening in the marketplace, but we're seeing fewer very high value transactions occur, which will drive our revenues down pretty significantly.
Thank you, Carmen. That's great breakdown there. I'm seeing if there are any questions that would like to submit through the chat. Or if you would like to, you can also unmute yourself and ask the question directly.
Our information is so straightforward. No questions needed.
All right. We do have one coming from Karen Chen with Channel 26 KTSF. She would like to ask, with such a huge drop in transfer tax revenues, will there be any city services being affected because of that?
Well, so just so folks know, when every year when the city puts together its budget, we have conversations with the controller and others to try to forecast as much as we possibly have information, what we think transfer tax numbers might look like. It's of course a very hard thing to do because we can't predict what the market will bring in the future. And we also can't predict kind of where the pandemic is going and how that impacts the economy. And so we do our very best, but the controller's office had already assumed lower tax revenue collections from transfer taxes already. So it really isn't so much about the comparison about how it impacts our budget is not so much about is it higher or lower than the previous years. It's really a comparison about how our actual revenues doing compared to where our budgeted revenues are. So I believe it's expected to be lower. We're still a few months into the year, so it's not quite clear yet how it's going to play out in terms of, again, the end of the year and so on. We might see a pickup in transactions at the end of the year. Again, if there are certain transactions that are waiting to try to avoid the transfer tax increase, the rate increase that will happen beginning of the year, but we have to yet to see. I think what is really unknown is what the pandemic will do in terms of changing the impact of people's behavior on when they want to buy and sell.
Thank you, Carmen. We also have another question coming from Kathleen Pender with San Francisco Chronicle. Do you have any reasons about the big recent drop in large transactions?
Yeah, it's hard to say. Number one, I think people were kind of taking a look to see kind of where things were going with the transfer tax measure as well. So I know that there were, at least anecdotally from what I've heard from folks in the marketplace, is that some people wanted to kind of see where that was going first. Now that they know potentially what the election results are, I think that's going to factor into their decision making about whether they want to move forward with a transaction more quickly rather than later. So I think there was a little bit of waiting to see where that would look like. Likewise, there were a number of other kind of ballot measures that were on the state ballot that would have been pretty impactful in terms of property, right? There was the Proposition 15, the split roll property tax item that would have potentially reassessed commercial property every 3 years. And so it doesn't look like that's going to pass. And so I think that you had a fair amount of people in the marketplace who were kind of waiting to see where the transfer tax measure was going to land, and also where kind of some of the real estate measures were going to land at the state level. And then I think separate from that, there's also just generally kind of unease around where COVID-19 is going to be and what that means for values right now. So people have questions about, what is the value of commercial property? What's the value of office spaces and so on? Especially if people believe that COVID-19 is going to change to some level the way that people work going forward. Are there going to be more people who will work remotely and so on? I'm still bullish on the belief that people do need some space to do work, and that there is still some efficiency and some kind of benefit to people getting together and collaborating in office space environments. But I think that there's a little bit of uncertainty in the marketplace about what that means for the future, and whether people want to pay the price right now for transactions, and whether they think that's a good deal. So I think there's a little bit of skittishness, or perhaps kind of unease around COVID-19's long-term impact, and that potentially has some bearing on it. And so it just really depends on kind of the real estate kind of industries, how people feel about buying and selling, and whether it's the right timing for it. So those are kind of the things that I've heard in the marketplace, at least. I'm not sure how much of that is going to change in the next month or two, especially with the transfer tax rate tier changing. But again, what you're seeing bear out in the numbers is we have relatively similar kind of average transaction numbers when it comes to pre-COVID versus after, but the amount of revenue is definitely lower. And so we're seeing kind of fewer transactions on that high value space.
Thank you, Carmen. We had a third question coming from Amanda Chan with Skylink TV. She has a question about if the Transamerica building or the Ocean State Center transaction was done, because those are really high value transactions, as we understand.
I do believe that the Transamerica transaction went through. I think that, if you accept, because we have to still do our valuation, so we haven't completed the valuation for that just yet, but if you accept the sales price as kind of right, I think that would bring in roughly about $3 million in additional revenue every year for San Francisco, because Transamerica has been under the same ownership for quite some time, and so there hasn't been a reassessment. But with this new transaction at the stated sales price, for example, if you believe that that was actually the right value, it would bring in roughly about $3 million in additional revenue to that. Ocean State, I haven't followed that one as quickly yet, so we can follow up with you on that.
Yeah, and Carmen was talking about the property tax as well on top of transfer tax that would be coming in, which transfer tax is the fee that comes in during the transaction and then afterward every year.
Yep, thanks for the clarification, because remember, with a transaction like, let's just say the Transamerica building, we would first collect a transfer tax on the actual transfer of that real estate. And then on an annual basis thereafter, we would have to reassess the taxable value, or the assessed value basically, of that building. That basically spells out how much that property would pay annually for property taxes going forward. So there's two impacts. One is on the transfer tax, and then the second is on the annual impact on property taxes.
Thank you, Carmen, for the clarification. So it looks like we don't have more questions coming in through the chat. This would be the last call of question if you want to unmute yourself or type your answer, type your question in the chat box. If not, we have recorded this session, so we'll share the recording with everyone. And also I'm sharing my email in the chat box if you have any follow-up questions for us as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for all of you for joining us again. And of course, we will share again the next time we have an update on the transfer tax revenue and hearing your questions. The next time we'll be prepared to speak to how our transfer tax is tracking compared to budget, because it sounds like that's something that everybody's very interested in. So we'll make sure to have that information for the next go around. If you have recommendations for the types of questions that you'd like us to answer along the way, please feel free to share that with Vivian as well, so that the next time we do this briefing, we'll provide that information to you. So again, hope everybody stays safe, especially right now with our most recent surge. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.